What if I told you that all of the modern sex ed movement in America today is based off of rape, sodomy, bestiality, and child pornography? Now listen, that sounds kooky and weird and conspiratorial, but if you learned anything from listening to me on the Seth Gruber Show, you'll know that there is a deeper hidden history to the more disturbing aspects and facets of secular progressivism than most Americans know, because they recognize that if that history were to be exposed and brought into the light of day a little bit, people would begin to recognize that rotten apple and the rotten fruit of liberalism they've been eating doesn't taste very good. Because maybe they knew where it came from. Maybe they're concerned about what kind of poison is in that fruit they're eating. Who poisoned this, right? What's the history behind this? And they would begin to live differently, pray differently, and certainly vote differently. I wanted to take a semi-deep dive with you today on the Seth Gruber Show into the history and deeds and aspects of what became modern sex ed. I'm talking about comprehensive sexuality education, of which Planned Parenthood admits on their own website they're the second largest provider of in America's public schools. I have a couple books with me here. I thought it would be fun to kind of do a learn along with Seth episode as we actually provide some of the proof and history behind the very fastly, rapidly growing movement to sexualize our children in America, incite them to a sexual frenzy, expose them to all forms of lewd, obscene, and inappropriate sexual practices and acts to encourage the early exercise of sexuality in youngsters. Because the left understands that he who controls the next generation controls the future. And that if you can usher in a sexual revolution, the people become pawns in the secular globalist master planners' arsenal, because those addicted to sexual arousal and satisfaction are easy to control. It's been called libido dominandi before. It's a phrase that comes from the city of God. In other words, sexual liberation is political control, right? I want you to think about sex addicts, okay? Any addict in your life, okay? People addicted to food, pornography, sex, drugs, alcohol. I want you to think about people who are enslaved to vices. Listen, a man has as many masters as he has vices. And so if the state encourages vices, it can create the need for controlling the citizens who no longer are able to govern themselves. A man has as many masters as he has vices. By promoting vice, the state promotes slavery, which can then be fashioned into a form of political control. Do you understand? Okay. The modern sex ed movement was man's attempt to sexualize the next generation as early as possible and as quickly as possible, to tear down the fruit of biblical faith, of virtue, right? Of self-control, of mastering yourself, of governing yourself, of saving sex for marriage, of recognizing that it's fundamentally procreative, right? That sex is fundamentally procreative. And when you do that stuff, sometimes babies happen. And when babies happen, then adults should sacrifice and do the hard things so that the rights of children are protected. And the rights of children, of course, begin when they come into existence, the moment of conception. But children also deserve a mother and a father who will lay aside their desires to protect children's rights and need for a mother and a father. But when you incite sexual chaos and sexual frenzy, everything else goes to bleep. Why? Because a man has as many masters as he has vices, okay? So what you need to understand is that sex ed in the schools for the left has become a tool of political control, okay? Mary Calderon, who founded SIECUS, which became the Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the United States, which is the kind of the pioneer of all the weird, kooky sex ed in the schools, okay, SIECUS. It was founded at the Kinsey Institute. It was founded at the Kinsey Institute with seed money provided by Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy magazine. So all of the science that became the basis, and I mean like science, okay? I don't mean science, I mean science, okay? Science-y, okay? That provided the basis for CSE, comprehensive sexuality education, was all Kinsey science. It was all based off of his 2 books and his study into human sexuality at the Kinsey Institute, which before was called the Institute for Sex Research, but I believe after his death was renamed the Kinsey Institute, okay? Now, before we get into some of the history of this, listen, don't take my word for it. I always say this, don't I? Don't take Seth Gruber's word for it. I'm here to bring all the receipts, baby. And also, when people tell you who they are, believe them. I'm a big believer in that. When someone tells you who they are, shows you who they are, don't question it. Just take their word for it. We did a social media reply video, and we'll have the team put this in right now. We'll show you right now.
Sex means different things to different people. Generally speaking, society tends to define sex in a very narrow way. Penetration, penis into vagina. But where does that definition leave queer people? Or folks who can't or don't have penis and vagina sex, and choose to have oral, anal, or another type of sex instead? Sex is defined by one thing and one thing only: you. Maybe that's being fingered for the first time. Maybe it's having anal sex. Maybe it's having your first orgasm. Maybe it's masturbating for the first time, or when you enthusiastically consent to sex. That's the beauty of your sexual journey. You're in charge, and you can figure it out on your own terms. Choosing to have sex, when, what kind, where, who with, is something that only you get to define.
I did a social media reply video a few months ago on my Instagram of a Planned Parenthood sex ed video with a very large woman. I don't know why they use very large men and women for these ads. Have you seen this? Have you seen this with everything, right? It's, by the way, the neo-Marxist, cultural Marxists of the Frankfurt School, they called it the uglification of beauty. You have to make everything ugly, because one of the reasons we have such beautiful buildings in Washington, D.C., and beautiful buildings that represented Western civilization until the rise of modernity was because of Christianity. It was Christians building things and thought that we should make beautiful things with our skills and our talents to make man's eyes go upward and draw his eyes to heaven and realize how small and insignificant he is in the grand scheme of the universe. So he'll humble himself and be used in his creator's hands for his purposes and bringing the kingdom to earth. We don't make beautiful buildings anymore, largely because we're living in a post-Christian society. But that's part of the reason behind why everything's ugly today. That was by design. The cultural Marxists at the Frankfurt School called it the uglification of beauty. We have to make everything ugly because then that makes you bland and boring. And it removes you from sort of the grander scheme and story of eternity. And Christianity is the most beautiful story ever. So Christians made beautiful things. Well, you can't have that in neo-pagan revivalism. So anyways, everything's ugly now. That's why all these underwear companies have fat models now wearing their underwear. That's all by design. So there's this very large woman, and unhealthy, obviously, in this Planned Parenthood sex ed video. And she's talking about sex ed, and she's talking about penises and condoms and anal sex, and however it feels good, whatever you should do it. And it's directed at teenagers. Did I say that? It's directed at teenagers. Well, guess what? In this Planned Parenthood video set that they designed, they curated what was on the set for their video shoot. Behind the large woman talking about sex to minors and all forms of sex, there's a mannequin wearing a shirt. And guess what the shirt says? Buckle up. The shirt says, on a Planned Parenthood video set, sex ed is power. All right, I'm done. I'm leaving the studio. Point made. What? Sex ed is power. Right. Libido dominandi. Sexual liberation as political control. Why is sex powerful? Because everyone's always known that. Okay? From the gal trying to get Samson to cut his hair off to Bathsheba, who I guess likes to shower in the open air. Have you ever wondered that, by the way? I had someone come up and tell me this the other day. I was like, that's a fascinating sort of recognition there. Someone came up to me when I talked about King David, and they're like, Seth, have you ever wondered why Bathsheba's shower was openly available for any dude who had a roof slightly taller than her home to see her bathing naked? like, hey, King David shouldn't have been doing that. Okay. The dude's responsible for his own actions. But you got to wonder, why is Bathsheba showering so openly, right? Like you're not dumb. You know that your shower is open to everyone to see. Okay. Anyways, but the point is that sex is powerful. And if you can incite a child or a man or a woman to sexual frenzies, you can drive them to their knees. And in Kamala Harris's actually case, that's literally the case. And so sex ed is power. That's the shirt Planned Parenthood puts on their own mannequin in a video about their comprehensive sex ed that comes from the CCIS, founded at Kinsey Institute, Kinsey Sex Ed. That's where that all comes from. On their own video set, openly admitting what I just told you, sex is power. Sex ed is power. It's not about the birds and the bees. And comprehensive sex ed, as we know it today, includes everything from gender theory to anal sex to every weird outlet of exercising your sexuality, to opposing parental rights, to teaching minors how to circumvent the law and get a judicial bypass to get an abortion without parental consent if you're a minor. Like all that stuff is in comprehensive sex ed, okay? It has like critical race theory stuff in there as well, okay? A hatred of traditional Christian norms, certainly. The normalizing of any kind of relationship that the libs can call a marriage. Okay, that's all comprehensive sex ed. It's not the birds and the bees. I wanted to come onto the show today with a couple resources, pull out a couple things for you guys, and say, y'all, here's where all of that comes from. So when Merrick Garland opened up an investigation into domestic terrorism of parents speaking at school board meetings because a dad raised his voice in Loudoun County, Virginia, okay? Because the school board's policies allowed a dude who says he's a girl to go into the girl's bathroom. And so a teenage boy who said he was a girl went into the girl's bathroom and he raped this dad's daughter, raped her. Okay? That was the school board's policy that allowed that. That's part of the gender theory and the comprehensive sex ed that started in the 40s and 50s with Kinsey, launches into the sex ed movement with its various organizations in the 60s. And I'm here today to tell you it's based off of rape, child pornography, sodomy, and bestiality. Yep. I have a whole chapter on this in my book, The 1916 Project. The chapter is called 1916 and the Sexual Revolution, which is probably the most comprehensive but accessible chapter, unless you want to study Judith Reisman. Judith Reisman, who I never had the chance to meet before she passed, but she devoted her life to exposing the fraudulent criminal history of Alfred Kinsey, who's been called the father of the sexual revolution, and whose science challenged social mores and norms and launched the sex ed movement as we know it today in America's public schools. So where did all this stuff come from? Well, firstly, you have to understand that Alfred Kinsey was a materialist. Okay, he was a Darwinian eugenicist who believed that we were just meat puppets. And so if it feels good, do it. Although the way that these people even talked about human nature and the body sort of assumed a deeper spiritual reality. So even the materialists, right, who say there's nothing but the physical world, right? Like, so we're meat puppets, we're pounds of flesh. So we're like animals. So if it feels good, do it. Like live like an animal, basically. And there's no soul, right? There's no eternal being. So one day you'll die and you'll take a dirt nap. And that's it. So even the materialists, though, the way that they would talk about sex and human nature almost assumed deeper spiritual premises, but they didn't have the language to articulate those premises. We see this today in the transgender movement, by the way. When the transgender movement says things like, I am not my body, right? Or trapped in the wrong body. Or what do they say? Born in the wrong body. That language assumes that you're something else than your body. Because if I am not my body, which, by the way, like that's like the phrase in the transgender movement. Do you understand that? That's like the phrase. I am not my body. There was a transgender documentary that was that a trans filmmaker on Kickstarter was fundraising for. Guess what it was called? I Am Not My Body. That was the name of it. Okay. But so if I am not my body, then the body is something else, and I am something. If I am not my body, listen how simple this is. Then I am something other than my body. And if I am something other than my body, which is my gender identity, then they're trying to talk about the soul. They just don't have the Christian language to articulate that. When they talk about gender identity and my real authentic self, they're trying to talk about the soul. but mostly transgender activists, right, and revolutionaries are on the left. They generally identify as atheist materialists, and yet their language assumes the sort of absorption of deeper spiritual premises that they don't have the language for. My point is, Alfred Kinsey was the first major person post-Enlightenment, or certainly modernity, to represent this sort of polarity in one person. I'm a materialist, everything is physical, but also I am not my body, which means I guess there's a spiritual reality. You understand how theological that all of the culture war is. And so Kinsey once said that there's no biological act that is disordered, and that he would call nothing biologically in the sexual realm wrong, meaning that the physiological response of orgasm is the same, whether it's with an animal, whether it's two men or two women or adult and child. It doesn't matter because the physiological response is the same. Wardell Pomeroy, who you'll recall was Kinsey's gay lover, he also was an investigator, researcher with John Money, the father of transgenderism, into gender identity research, whatever that means. And Wardell Pomeroy was part of the pro-incest lobby and pro-incest movement, and he took over the Kinsey Institute when Alfred Kinsey died. Wardell Pomeroy once said, physically, animal relations may become of considerable significance to the boy who is having regular experience, and in no point are they basically different from those that are involved in erotic responses to human situations. What does that mean? All physiological responses are the same in orgasm. Do you understand? He just said it. The relations between animals and boys is basically no different from those in erotic responses to human situations, meaning a man and woman having sex, what's the difference really between that and a boy and a farm animal? Because the physiological response is the same. So that's the kind of materialism that even governed the language Kinsey would use. So Kinsey was not only called the father of the sexual revolution, but he really popularized the phrase, all children are sexual. That children are sexual beings. That's the belief of these weirdo, kooky, I think it's safe to say borderline pedophilic master planners of the sexual revolution. Without going into too much detail, although we'll scratch the surface over the next few minutes, his book, Sexuality in the Human Male, which I believe was published in 1948, supercharged the sexual revolution. And this is where the premise that children are sexual beings comes from, okay? This book that I'm looking at with you today on the show is called Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, written by Judith Reisman, who I mentioned earlier, who became the first real mama bear that exposed the history of all this disgusting pornographic history of the sex ed movement in the schools, and how its education and scientific discoveries set the stage for the destruction of the family and sexual mores, and eventually laws that protected women, children, and marriage, meaning it led to the decreasing of penalties and consequences for sexual criminals because, don't you know, all children are sexual from the moment of birth. This is the premise that drove Kinsey in all of his research. So where did this come from? Well, Kinsey and his researchers at the Kinsey Institute, or the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University, they went into the prisons and they interviewed pedophiles and rapists serving lifetime prison sentences to get their recounting of their rape and their sexual crimes. And they masqueraded this data in Kinsey's books and research as kind of the normal sexual behavior of the normal American male. The most shocking aspect of Kinsey's book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, is Table 34, which charts how many orgasms children had over a 24-hour period, all timed with a stopwatch. The children were between 5 months and 10 years old. You heard that right. An 11-month-old baby apparently had 10 orgasms in an hour. Another had 14 in 38 minutes. It's all in his book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Kinsey obtained this data from sexual criminals serving life prison sentences, and he argued, listen, that the children enjoyed their sexual torture, and this proved that children were sexual beings. Do you understand how demonic and dark the seeds of the sex ed movement are getting here? Now, his most notorious subject, interviewed in 1944, was a sexual omnivore whose history of sexual encounters with men, women, boys, girls, animals, and family members took 17 hours to record, according to the New York Times. I'm going to tell you who that person was in just 1 second. Not only did Kinsey fail to report this subject to the proper authorities, but he also falsified data to make it appear that this one person's responses to his survey questions came from multiple people. Do you understand? He interviewed one sexual omnivore, pedophile, sodomizer, rapist, and made it sound like that data came from multiple people, okay? This had the effect of making the sex criminals' proclivities appear more mainstream than they in fact were. Kinsey never condemned this animal. Instead, he continued to solicit data from him and attempted to pay him for further research. So that makes Kinsey an accomplice to the crime. Do you understand? Hey, pedophile rapist, I'm going to pay you for you to continue doing what you're doing to children so you can come back and report it to me. Writing to this pedophile monster, Kinsey said, quote, "I wish I knew how to give credit to you in the forthcoming volume for your material. It seems a shame to not even name you," end quote. The data Kinsey collected was hardly based on a sample of the general population, but the results, once published, had the effects of normalizing all kinds of sexual perversion. And Kinsey was blatantly honest about his true motives, by the way. Okay, he wanted to normalize all sexual acts because he believed everyone is a sexual being even from the moment of birth. Who was this sexual criminal, animal, pedophile, rapist, bestiality, like demon? His name is Rex King, okay? Rex King. Thanks to a Yorkshire documentary entitled Secret History, Kinsey's Pedophiles, a broadcast in Great Britain on August 10th, 1998, the filmmakers behind this Yorkshire documentary actually got a bunch of Kinsey's key researchers and colleagues and eventual directors of the Kinsey Institute to admit some of this stuff that's been buried. By the way, you can watch this documentary, Secret History, Kinsey's Pedophiles, on YouTube. It's very difficult to find, but I'll have my team put the link in the show notes to this episode, and you can go watch it, and I recommend and suggest that you do. The interviewer asked Paul Gebhard. Now, Paul Gebhard later became the director of the Kinsey Institute. He was a researcher and friend of Alfred Kinsey's. Whether he was one of Kinsey's gay lovers, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised by it. So this interviewer asked Paul Gebhard, how did Kinsey come in contact with the pedophiles? Well, in Britain, they say pedophiles or pedophiles. Paul Gebhard said that was rather easy. We got them in prisons, a lot of them. We'd go after them. Then there was also a pedophile organization in this country, not incarcerated, and they cooperated. You had one in Britain, a British pedophile organization. Kinsey relied upon Rex King for the chapter on childhood sexuality in the male volume. Okay, this is Paul Gebhard, who became the executive director of the Kinsey Institute and one of Kinsey's key researchers. Do you understand what I'm saying to you right now? Okay. Paul Gebhard said, Kinsey relied upon Rex King for the chapter on childhood sexuality in the male volume. And he's referring to his book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, because he later published Sexual Behavior in the Human Female the same year that Playboy magazine was founded. And Hugh Hefner called himself Kinsey's pamphleteer and Kinsey's prophet. Paul Gebhard continues and says, I think that he was in the presence of a pathology at large. Kinsey elevated to, the realm of scientific information what should have been dismissed as unreliable, self-serving data provided by a predatory pedophile. I don't have any doubt in my own mind that that man wreaked havoc in a lot of lives. Many of his victims were infants, and Kinsey in that chapter himself gives pretty graphic descriptions of their response to what he calls sexual stimulation. If you read those words, what he's talking about is kids who are screaming, kids who are protesting in every way that they can the fact that their bodies or their persons are being violated. What did Paul Gebhard, Kinsey's researcher and eventual director of the Kinsey Institute, just tell you? That most of Kinsey's data to prove the sexuality of children came from Rex King, who raped, sodomized, and attacked, I don't know, hundreds of innocent people, women, and children over years. And Kinsey paid him to continue the research and said, I wish I could give you credit in my forthcoming volume. That's just a little bit about Rex King. This is interesting. Jonathan Gathorne Hardy, who's one of the more bombshell biographers of Kinsey, although probably an admirer, was willing to go where many biographers would not go on Kinsey. And Jonathan Gathorne Hardy, who wrote a biography on Alfred Kinsey, reveals that Kinsey Institute director John Bancroft secretly allowed him to read and copy Kinsey's pedophile team reports. It becomes clear that the Kinsey Institute covered for and protected pedophiles. Here's what the biographer for Kinsey said. He said, Kinsey was deeply affected by 5 pedophile headmasters who had loving relationships with young adolescent boys of 12 or 13. The reason the Kinsey Institute is so careful is that they have evidence of sexual behaviors that even now are illegal. They are nervous that sons or grandsons will sue them if they let this information out. So they had to be very, very careful that names are not revealed in that way. Names of what? Pedophiles and sexual criminals. So these are Kinsey Institute people, John Bancroft, who became a director of the Kinsey Institute, okay, Paul Gebhard, who became a director of the Kinsey Institute, saying we protected the names and identities of pedophiles and their sexual crimes so we could keep getting their data to prove the basis of modern comprehensive sexuality in America today. This is just the beginning of how dark and depraved all of this gets. Paul Gebhard said about the Kinsey Institute that they protected Rex King so that they could get more data. Do you understand? Paul Gebhard said, if we had turned him in, it would have been the end of our research project. Who? Rex King, a sexual omnivore pedophile rapist. We don't want to turn these people in because they're giving us really good data to broadcast the fraudulent message that all children are sexual and can have orgasms from several weeks or months old, and that they have a right to sexual pleasure. That's the beginning of the pedophilic history behind what today is all of the comprehensive sexuality education. And if you think I'm a weirdy, kooky conspiracy theorist here, go do your own research. I've done the research at looking at the modern major sex ed organizations today that write the curriculum. And when you do the hard work of following the citations, right, where did that claim come from? You go to that source. Where did that claim come from? You go to the source it cites. Where did that claim come from? You go to the source that it cites. You end up back at the Kinsey Institute every single time. Before we wrap up this episode, I want to thank our sponsors at Every Life Diaper Company. EveryLife.com. The pro-life diaper company for America. Almost every major baby company industry diaper manufacturer rhetorically or financially supports the abortion industry. If you want to defund the culture of death, fight with your dollars, and rebuild a culture of life, come on, wouldn't it be great to bankrupt Marxist pro-abortion, anti-family companies? I think that would be awesome. But you got to fight with your wallet too. So if you have babies or loved ones with babies, pregnancy resource centers, or the nursery at your church, go to everylife.com, promo code Seth10, Seth10, for 10% off your first order, and let them know that we sent you. You support the Seth Gruber Show, you support the White Rose Resistance, and you help rebuild a culture of life in the marketplace by fighting with your dollars, because money talks, baby. Money talks. Everylife.com, promo code Seth10. Thank you, EveryLife, for sponsoring the Seth Gruber Show. So that's why he's called the father of the sexual revolution. Paul Gebhard says, children are sexual beings. Little males get erections, even in utero. He says they are sexual from the word go. Rex King contributed a fair amount to our knowledge and medicine's knowledge of the sexuality of children. We made our point that children are sexual from birth. There you go. Paul Gebhard, director of the Kinsey Institute. We made our point that children are sexual from birth. That was the point of the Kinsey Institute. Later, SECUS, which was founded by Planned Parenthood's medical director, Mary Calderon, admitted what their goal was as well. She was speaking before the 1980 annual meeting of the Association of Planned Parenthood Physicians, and Mary Calderon reportedly explained that providing today's society very broadly and deeply with awareness of the vital importance of infant and childhood sexuality is now the primary goal of SECUS. SECUS, the pioneer of the pornographic, obscene, comprehensive sexuality education, SECUS, launched by Planned Parenthood's medical director with seed money provided by the Playboy founder, launched at the Kinsey Institute, and all of the science based off of Alfred Kinsey's fraudulent research, citing a sexual omnivore, bestiality, child pornographer, rapist, and pedophile as the basis for the scientific claims that provided the basis for the modern sex ed movement as we know it today. I want to add one more thing here. We'll do another episode on how the fraudulent history and beginnings of the sex ed movement in America began to change the laws for how such crimes were punished. Laws that used to protect children, women, family, and marriages. And really the legal impact of this demonic history. But there's one more aspect of this history behind the modern sex ed movement that I wanted to contribute and add to this episode. And if you want a deeper treatment of all of this, of course, you can get Judith Reisman's book, Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, or you can get my book, The 1916 Project, if you want a more condensed but sort of comprehensive treatment without going all the way down the rabbit hole. But one of the things that is the most shocking aspect of the sex ed movement as we know it today is that Alfred Kinsey got a lion's share of his research, interviews, and sex diaries from a Nazi pedophile child rapist who ran a concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Poland, where he raped and sodomized hundreds of children and gave them the option between him or the gas chamber, meaning either be raped by this man or go get gassed, okay? He's a Nazi pedophile child rapist named Dr. Fritz von Balusek. Yes, that is his name, Dr. Fritz von Balusek, who was identified in Berlin newspapers and journalists as the most important pedophile criminal in the criminal history of Berlin. You heard that correctly. And by the way, thanks to this Yorkshire documentary, Kinsey's Pedophiles, which you can access on YouTube, the relationship between Alfred Kinsey and this Nazi child pedophile rapist became public knowledge. But of course, much of the American journalists on the left in the States had no interest of pursuing this story, which of course is incredibly shocking, right? That the father of the sexual revolution got a ton of his data that provided the basis for the science of sexuality of children from a Nazi pedophile child rapist working for Hitler who ran a concentration camp. Like, very interesting that modern journalists in America didn't want to discover more of this. But Judith Reisman in her book exposes what the Yorkshire investigators in their film had discovered, that at least one of Kinsey's sex collaborators was a documented Nazi, Dr. Fritz von Balusek. And like Kinsey, fascist scientists in Germany believed that they had a right to experiment on anyone. But this man, Dr. Fritz von Balusek, was an incest offender who raped and sodomized not only his own offspring, but Jewish, Polish, and German children as well from 1927 to 1957. That's 30 years, folks. The German press reported Kinsey's visit to Frankfurt during his world tour in 1956. Little else is available regarding the German stop or if Kinsey met with Balusek, and there was no mention of Kinsey's visit to Frankfurt in the approved writings about Kinsey's European travels. However, their pen-pal relationship and letters later became public knowledge. The German press described early attempts to cover up who Balusek really was, including efforts to keep his photograph under wraps and the court description of the influential attorney as a shop worker. So in the trial for Dr. Fritz von Balusek, who somehow escaped the Nuremberg trials, he was later brought up on charges for a sex murder, meaning he raped a young girl and then murdered her. And Judge Berger in Berlin read the accounts of Balusek's sex journals and diaries and exclaimed, according to the Morgan Post on May 16, 1957, he exclaimed, "This is no longer human. What was all this for? To tell Kinsey about?" End quote. Do you understand what I just said? A judge in Berlin presiding over the criminal prosecution of Dr. Fritz von Balusek read his sex diaries and said, "This isn't human. Why did you do this? Just for Kinsey? To tell Kinsey?" Well, yes, actually. One such German newspaper in Berlin at the time, on October 1st, 1957, said Balusek corresponded with the American Kinsey Institute for some time and had also got books from them which dealt with childhood sexuality. The National Zeitung on May 15th, 1957, said, "Today the court has got 4 diaries, and in these diaries, with cynicism and passion, he recorded his crimes against 100 children in the smallest detail. He sent the details of his experiences regularly to the United States sex researcher Kinsey. The latter was very interested and kept up a regular and lively correspondence with Balusek." So this was documented in German newspapers. The American press seemed to have no interest in learning more about this story. I'm simply telling you right now that a lion's share of the sexual data, which Kinsey manufactured to make it sound like it came from hundreds or multiple sources or interviewees, came from a couple men, Rex King, a sexual omnivore pedophile rapist, and a Nazi pedophile rapist leading a concentration camp in a Polish town called Jezdro, who raped and sodomized not only his own children, but Jewish and Polish children, and according to reports at the time, gave those children the option between him or the gas chambers, somehow escaped the Nuremberg trials, and years later was criminalized and prosecuted for a sex murder, and his relationship with Alfred Kinsey, the sex researcher, began to become public knowledge. Paul Gebhard, remember who I was citing earlier, who took over for the Kinsey Institute and said that we covered for these pedophiles because we wanted that research, wrote an article in this book, Ethical Issues in Sex Therapy and Research, okay? Paul Gebhard writes an article in here called Designated Discussion, and on page 13 he says, "We have always ran the cost of becoming amoral at best or criminal at worst." He says, "An example of our criminality is our refusal to cooperate with authorities in apprehending a pedophile we had interviewed who was being sought for a sex murder." Do you know who he's referring to? Dr. Fritz von Balusek, the Nazi childhood pedophile rapist. How many of his sex diaries detailing and recounting the sex and murder of Jewish and Polish children, including his own offspring, became the basis for Alfred Kinsey's sex research. And we know, according to Paul Gebhard, by the way, okay, in his interviews in the Yorkshire documentary, Kinsey's Pedophiles, that Kinsey's team and Kinsey himself before his death refused to turn over his letters with Dr. Fritz von Balusek to the FBI, who were investigating this, and to Interpol. They refused to turn them over. Kinsey and his team were involved in criminal acts, carrying water and protecting criminals and pedophiles from those trying to stop their crimes, thereby being complicit in allowing the crimes to continue, which they masqueraded as scientific inquiries and interviewers with the normal American man who just happens to have sex with animals and children. And so, I mean, if you think about it, shouldn't we reduce the laws because so many people are doing this? That became the basis for the Kinsey Institute's war and revolution on the American family, marriage, and sexual mores in the West. That just scratches the basis. That just scratches the surface of the history of the demonic sex ed revolution that has led to the transgender movement, the gender revolution, the attack against parental rights, and the foisting of pornography curriculum onto minors in America. That's the beginning of where all of that comes from. On the next episode, we'll take a deep dive into how all of that began to affect our laws in America and making it more dangerous to be a woman, a children, decreasing crimes, decreasing penalties for sexual criminals, and the beginning of the disintegration of the nuclear family as we know it in America today. The books I had today on the show were Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences by Judith Reisman, and a very disturbing book that's a collection of essays called Ethical Issues in Sex Therapy and Research, with essays from people like Paul Gebhard, who took over the Kinsey Institute for Alfred Kinsey. Thank you guys for listening to this difficult episode today. We want to do more of this kind of learn along with Seth on the show where we bring resources. We did this whole book as a book club for our $70 a month donors at the White Rose Resistance. So if you want to join us, go to thewhiterose.life, become an ally or air support at $35 or $70 a month. Go subscribe at iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and Rumble. Give us a rating and review. Subscribe at Rumble to protect us if we ever get removed from YouTube. And make sure you pick up the book and screen the film at your church, The 1916 Project, by going to the1916project.com and join us in Washington, D.C. the day before the March for Life or Death Con, lifeordeathcon.com with Dr. George Grant, A.J. Hurley, Nancy Piercy, Ali Bestucky, Eric Metaxas, Pastor Andrew Cedra, and more, as we begin to awaken and mobilize the people of God to retake their place on the wall by tearing down the high places of child sacrifice in America and giving God a reason to bring revival to America. Until next time, I'm Seth Gruber, and this is The Seth Gruber Show.